Israel on this episode of Whispers of a Dark Future in the year of Kamala Harris.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
All right, so I want to talk about Israel, but specifically a side of Israel not mentioned a whole lot. So, what is mentioned a lot is Israel's attack on Palestinians, who are often framed as non Jewish, even though there are obviously Jewish Palestinians exist. But a lot of the framing on Israel is its attacks on sort of non Jewish people and things like that. What Bean wants to talk about here is Israel's attacks on Jewish people. So Israel, for being, is what's called an ethnocracy, which is essentially a constitutional democracy that upholds the rights and rule of law, but only for a specific ethnicity. In this case, Ashkenazi Jews, whereas everybody else is put into a secondary system and basically weighed and measured and judged far differently and far more bigotedly as they're considered outside of the ethnos. And so the larger point, of course, I think will be to say that Israel, it's not only a threat to the people of Gaza, the people, the Palestinians trying to get liberation and things like that, but it's also a threat to Jewish people in itself. And because I think what's important about focusing on having something focusing on this is a lot of Israel's arguments for its own existence is that it's protecting Jewish people from existential threats that Jewish people have faced over the years of its diasporic movement. And so I think it's good also to have an argument that shows, or to have something that shows, that not only is Israel threatening non-Jewish lives, but it's also threatening the very lives of the group it's purporting to protect. And with ethnocracies, the people in the ethnos aren't completely safe either. Because if any Ashkenazi Jew critiques the regime or resists the regime, they too are targeted. So, Piper, would you like to bring up some episodes of Israel attacking non-Jewish people? Future Being here. Being actually meant to ask Piper to give examples of Israel attacking Jewish people, not attacking non-Jewish people, but this all sort of worked out anyway, so no big deal.
Yeah, so attacking non-Jewish people is sort of like the bread and butter of Israel. Israel was created as a settler colonial state. And so the whole point of Israel, as admitted, in fact, freely admitted and insisted upon by Israel's founding fathers, was the construction of a state for the Jewish people, that is to be sovereign in territory where indigenous Palestinians live, and is thus to drive out those indigenous Palestinians, something they euphemistically called transfer, and replace the Palestinians with a Jewish settler population. So, yeah, the violence against non-Jewish people ranges from the 1948 Nakba, in which Jewish settler militias expelled, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes and villages, razed villages to the ground, murdered Palestinians, etc. And to this day, the refugees and descendants of refugees from the 1948 Nakba are not allowed to return to Israel. In fact, whenever in negotiations the right of return for those people comes up, Israel sort of, scoffs at that, and it's a sort of unreasonable demand. Then there's, of course, the system of apartheid acknowledged by human rights groups that was set up in the occupied territories, Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, where the free movement of Palestinians is governed by special IDs and military checkpoints, and Palestinians are subject to military rule, whereas Israelis have free movement and are subject to civilian rule. In fact, even Palestinian citizens of Israel have to have special IDs to travel where they want to travel to, right? So their freedom of movement is constrained in a way that non-Palestinian, particularly Ashkenazi Israeli citizens is not. Yeah, despite these people being citizens of Israel. So,
right. So wait.
Yeah.
So in Israel, if you're a Palestinian who is Jewish, are you still subjected to this treatment?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't really matter if,
Right.
if you're a Palestinian, your freedom of movement is going to be constricted in a way that, non-Palestinians is not constricted, at the very least. And you will definitely, you're more than likely to be subject to the system of, military rule,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
Right, so this regime makes
Yeah.
no so I think what I wanna emphasize is sort of the ethnic dimension of this regime where instead of because I think a lot of people try to frame this in more religious terms, but
Right.
there is a really big ethnic dimension to this. So, because what you're saying is, let's say you're a Palestinian and you're a devout, Jewish person and you would just follow all the correct laws and everything, doesn't matter because you're not specifically part of a specific subgroup within Judaism. It doesn't matter how faithful you are, how much of a law observer you would be, simply because you're part of what deemed a different ethnic group. You are subjected to oppression.
Right. There's also the fact that what matters to whether, you're considered a full, Israeli citizen is, not just whether, are you Jewish, right? As opposed to being non-Jewish. Also, basically, are you an Ashkenazi Jew? So, non-Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, right? Non-European Jews. Those Jewish people are identified in mainstream academic literature on Israel, Palestine as second-class citizens within Israel. There's there was a scandal that was publicized about in the Israeli sort of publication Haaretz, where there was testimony from many Ethiopian women about the their sort of sterilization at the hands of doctors inside Israel. And this testimony exists at such a level that, it's suggestive of a sort of systematic policy of abuse. So, that's a very salient sort of example of how Israel treats Jews who are not Ashkenazi Jews.
Right. Yeah, so, I mean, if being remembers correctly, it wasn't until I think 2013 that the Israeli government outright confirmed they were doing this, and they're like, "Oh, we're sorry." And it's interesting with that kind of apology because it's sort of like, "Oh, sorry for forcibly trying to destroy an ethnic group within our own state. We won't do it again." Because you had Ethiopian Jewish people come to Israel, and the Israeli state looked at them. They didn't look at them as, oh, these are other Jewish people. This is a land for them. They looked at them as as an alien, right? And because they didn't belong to the subset of Jewish person they wanted, and so their plan was to fewer their numbers by limiting their offspring. This is a Is it interesting because forced sterilization is like one of the textbook ways in which you engage in genocidal practices against other people. So this example is perfect because it's sort of one could argue the state of Israel not only does it engage in genocides against non-Jewish people, it engages in genocidal practice against other Jewish people, right? So Israel will say that its existence is because of things like the Holocaust, right? And it's interesting because during the Holocaust, all Jews were destroyed. There was no like Hitler didn't have this whole thing of like, well, only this group of Jew is good, and we're da 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 da. No, all of them were destroyed. And Israel comes along and says, okay, we're gonna have a homeland for us because of things like this happening. But then that very homeland, goes and engages in genocidal practice against other Jews. The irony here is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, it's sort of the subtext of the Israeli conception of itself as a nation is that, yeah, it's the state for the Jews, but it's really the state for Ashkenazi Jews. Like I said, Mizrahi Jews are identified as second-class citizens. And so it's not really a state for the Jews. If you're an Ethiopian Jew, Middle Eastern Jew, it's not a state for you, right? It's a state for European Jews. The whole point of the Israel as a colonial project, was in fact importing Jewish people from Europe to become settlers on a land that was being claimed and taken away from the indigenous population by a sort of European Zionist movement. So, so there's just no way that the claim that it's a state for anyone but Ashkenazi Jews can be sustained.
Right. Is there any more examples you can think of Israel harming other Jewish people?
So other Jewish people, well, one thing I think should be said is that Israel's status as a settler colonial state also endangers Israeli citizens who are considered part of the Israeli nation. So, these people get privileges by this sort of system of apartheid that at least Ashkenazi citizens of Israel get privileges by this system of apartheid and the settler colonial regime that one, Palestinians certainly don't get, and two, Mizrahi Jews don't get. But because the Israeli state, as a settler state, has to violently dispossess indigenous people of their land in order to exist, it then throws the security of the citizens of Israel into question. Basically, every non-state actor, right? Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, you name it, that has ever posed a threat to Israel and its security exists only because of the existence of Israel and its policies of violent dispossession of the indigenous people. It's interesting to note that now that region of the Middle East is known as, this conflict zone between Muslims and Jews, but under the Ottoman Empire, Sephardic Jews who were persecuted by the Inquisition in Spain took refuge. And under Ottoman rule, Jews and Christians were tolerated among Muslims as people of the book. So this only became a conflict zone between Jews and Muslims when a movement of specifically European Jews created a regime on the basis of the violent dispossession of indigenous people. So, without the decades long starving of Gaza through the blockade, the de facto control that Israel has exercised since Hamas won elections in 2007, that sort of, condition that Israel has foisted on the Gazans that's been described as an open air prison, that was a key ingredient in Hamas sort of solidifying its control over the strip. And in fact, that's what Israel wanted to happen so that, Hamas could be a sort of loyal opposition policing mechanism for the people of Gaza. But also, you don't get October 7th without that, you know, open air prison condition being foisted on the people of Gaza for, what, over 20 years? Not quite, actually, not quite 20 years yet, but it was getting close to 20 years when the Gaza war started. So, it's just very clear that whenever Israel invokes attacks on Israeli civilians by non state actors like Hamas or like Palestinian Islamic Jihad or whoever, as a reason that Israel needs to be there to protect the Jews in the region, that is a sort of, it's a dishonest tactic because the only reason attacks like that happen, the only reason you get October 7th is because of Israel's role as an institution which can only exist by violence against Palestinians and really violence against non-Ashkenazis.
Right. Yeah, you made the point of like it's interesting because when Israel built itself as fighting Islamic forces and non-Jews, that whole attack of of non-Jewish people is really also a part of the attacks on Jewish people because they're reinforcing hostile conditions between these two people groups, between these two religious groups that ultimately harms their own people because there are plenty of there are plenty of, let's say, Ashkenazi Jews in Israel who would like to not be under threat of violence from their own government constantly engaging in predatory tactics against its people within its own state and people and its all of its different neighbors. So really another way that Israel harms Jews is when it harms non-Jews as well. So I mean, I guess it all kind of comes full circle and all becomes connected. Another thing that probably doesn't help anybody is when the Syrian civil war, when the Salvation government was sweeping through Syria, Israel, in its infinite wisdom, decided to invade and get more territory in Syria. Which what an amazing tactic! Because what a brilliant tactic that is to just further entrench itself as this pariah state that will just take any opportunity it can to get as much territory as it can whenever the opportunity is presented. And that obviously does not help its relationship with its neighbors.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the course of the war in Gaza, Israel has taken a profoundly sort of, it will say defensive, but I will say offensive posture against other entities in the region, not just Hamas, Israel, because of the Houthis attacking Israel as a result of the war in Gaza. Israel has, both the Houthis and Hezbollah, attacking Israel to defend Gaza, or in solidarity with Gaza. Israel has, unleashed quite a bit of firepower against both of them. In fact, before a ceasefire was concluded with Hezbollah, Israel was almost fighting a second war in Lebanon that was actually killing Lebanese at a faster pace than the genocide in Gaza was killing Palestinians. And then, once the perhaps, maybe the most significant case here is, when the Assad regime fell, despite the coming to power of the HTS with a leader that was actually looking to be more friendly towards Israel because he wanted to be more friendly to the West in general. Israel, instead of taking the opportunity to normalize relations, Israel took the opportunity to violently seize Syrian land. So, basically Israel's posture is just, in this war, essentially, is attack everybody we don't like. And, that's just not going, it's clearly not going to provide security for the Israeli Jews that Israel supposedly exists to protect, and it's also, there's a wider problem where, in doing this kind of stuff, in associating this kind of, rabid dog posture with, the so-called state of the Jews, Israel does, as basically as much as you can possibly do to perpetuate anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish feeling, not only among people in the Middle East, but among people watching internationally. When you associate, the self-determination of Jewish people with violent dispossession of other people, and attacking everybody you don't like wantonly, that is going to fan the flames of bigotry against the Jews. How could it not?
Right, because any Jewish scholar who comes out and writes a book criticizing the regime is just deemed an enemy by the regime, and then they're gonna not be allowed to go on anything, right? And a lot of, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the rhetoric around the existence of Israel as a state is interesting because it sort of makes this. Yeah, and we've brought this up before. This idea that Jewish people have to have their own nation state to ever be able to continue to live. I mean, as an anarchist podcast, I would go further and say I think it's sort of bigoted in the long run for anybody to suggest they have their own nation state in order for humanity to get along. Everybody has to be separated in these little pockets around the world, and then each state imprisons and prosecutes and oppresses its own citizenry. But this more specifically, this idea that like Jewish people can't be part of other regions of the world, that they have to, go to this place and sort of build up this army and in order to be protected, I think sort of has this underlying idea baked into it that Jewish people can never integrate or become part of non-Jewish communities, which I think is a terrible thing to reinforce. It's also another great irony too, right? Because I think the best way to destroy anti-Semitism and the best way to destroy a lot of this bigotry is to make a radical argument for the harmony and cooperation between all different peoples and say no, Jews can in fact live with non-Jewish people, they can in fact live with Muslims, they can, everybody can't, instead of pursuing this violent policy of no, Jews have to separate themselves, and not even just Jews, this specific subset of Jews, and then other Jews, are going to be treated violently. I think also engaging in 19th century colonialism is its own quagmire, or its own cluster of shenanigans, because they're
Right.
engaged in a lot of these old colonial. I mean, there's a reason a lot of these countries no longer do this anymore and have swayed toward newer means of oppressing people. And I think I mean, presuming certain things, I think in the long run, Israel is going to be seen in the same light as apartheid South Africa was. And I think in the long run, this entire episode will be deemed a bloodstain on the history of nation states and on the history of the Jewish people, to look back and, not only do Jewish people have to deal with the Holocaust, now they have to deal with this sort of this mimetic monster, right? Sort of like a mimic of trying to argue, this monster pretending to be a friend, right? Instead of all these other regimes that committed anti-Semitism because they wanted to get rid of Jews, you have this regime which has built itself up as the Jewish regime, and then it engages in all these monstrous activities, which I think in the long run is
Right.
good of like a huge gash on the history of the Jewish people, to try and amend all this damage the state did, and trying to, rebuild with other communities, and everything like that. I mean, I think it's good that it's great that, like, well, probably this is probably one of the few good things about what has happened recently with Israel, is that people are like, a lot of the opinion about Israel swaying in the opposite direction now. They're
Right.
no longer accepting this anymore. It's unfortunate it requires all this damage for that to happen, but that's the only silver lining, is that people are going to kind of are starting to realize how much this is just not a regime that needs to be supported in any way. Um,
Right.
so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing I'll say maybe to close out here is I think that Zionism, from the moment it was conceived, was a concession to European anti Semitism. The idea was, okay, look, the European anti Semites, they don't want us here, right? They don't think we belong living among the Gentiles, right? They want to exclude us. They're right. We should exclude ourselves, right? In order to protect ourselves from anti Semitic violence. It's like, no, it's sort of the same mistake you find in, like, oh, in order to protect ourselves against racism, we need to do black separatism. And so then you have, black nationalist groups meeting up with white supremacists to talk about how much they agree that everybody should be segregated. I mean, it's, you don't achieve self determination by creating an exclusive society based on the exclusion of other people. The way that Jewish people achieve self-determination, the way that anti-Semitism is ended, is when there is a struggle that ends up in the free associations of Jews with Gentiles. It's not conceding to European anti-Semites to say, okay, fine, we'll voluntarily leave Europe. I mean, it's just the fact that people don't see how wrongheaded that is somewhat amazing to me. And so, even putting aside the fact that Israel is a settler colonial entity, even if, the Zionists had found a totally uninhabited stretch of land to build the Jewish state, the fundamental point is still going to be that they're saying, yes, the anti Semites are right. We can't live with the Gentile. I mean, that's, you're just conceding to the basic premise of anti Semitism that the Jews shouldn't exist, at least not here. Maybe they can exist elsewhere, right? But we're not gonna let them exist here. Like, why would you concede that to why would you offer that level of concession to a bigoted point of view? Like, why would there's just no reason to.
Yeah. I guess the last thing to say is that Netanyahu is a big poo poo turd. I
Yeah.
can't cuss because YouTube gets silly about that, but
Yeah.
Netanyahu is a duty face.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
and
I
I
mean,
mean,
it's sad. I mean, one thing to say is it's had some consequences for him too. I mean, if he has to make sure to take, roundabout routes when he's flying to the United States now, so he doesn't end up in a country that would observe the ICC warrant for his arrest. Also,
yeah.
one of his residences was bombed by Hezbollah, some months ago. So
A country should do the most epic prank ever. Be like, oh yeah, we're cool with you. You come over here. Yeah, we love all you're doing, right? And he takes the plane, he lands, And then they go up to him and they go, "Get him!" And then they arrest him and like, "Ha!" This would be like the most epicest prank ever. And then like
Yeah.
he's put in front of an international court and everything.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Yep.
Final word.
If you like the podcast, subscribe, check out the Patreon, and also check out our individual channels. There's mine, which is just Piper Tompkins, and then there's Being's channel, Post Comprehension. All the links will be in the description.
Wait, I want to say something real quick.
Yeah.
Kitchen sink, carrot, and chicken.
I don't understand.
Neither does Being. Goodbye.
Epic.
You exist in the context.